Good evening again, everyone. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's book talk for Irena's Gift, an epic World War II memoir of sisters, secrets, and survival, as part of our Stories Survive series. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you again for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, you will visit the museum in person to see our current and upcoming exhibitions, including Art of Freedom, the life and work of Arthur Szyk, which opened recently on December 7th, 2025. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. Now, during the program, if you have questions for our speakers, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Now, again, that's the Zoom Q&A box rather than the chat. Now, today, we are honored to be joined by Kirsten and Robin Judd. A former business executive, Kirsten is an Australian-American author and Holocaust educator. She's the author of Irena's Gift, a 2025 National Jewish Book Award finalist, winner of Zibby Awards for Best Family Drama, and Best Story of Overcoming. Karen's essay, Searching for the Nazi Who Saved My Mother's Life, was selected by Narratively as one of their best ever stories and nominated for the Best American Essays. Her writing has also appeared in Salon.com, Huffington Post, The Week, The Jerusalem Post, Boston's National Public Radio Station, The Boston Herald, The Christian Post, The Sydney Morning Herald, and more. Robin Judd is Distinguished Professor of History at The Ohio State University, where she directs the Hoffman Leaders and Leadership Program in History. She is the author of Contested Rituals, Circumcision, Kosher Butchering, and German Jewish Political Life in Germany, 1843 to 1933, and Between Two Worlds, Jewish War Brides After the Holocaust, which garnered 2 National Jewish Book Awards and was named a finalist for the 2024 Ohioana Nonfiction Award. She currently chairs Ohio's Holocaust and Genocide Memorial and Education Commission and the Faculty Advisory Board of the Leo Baeck Institute. Thank you again for joining us. I'll now hand things over to Karen and Robin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Isabel. And thank you, Karen, for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you about your incredible book. This is
Oh, thank you, Robin, and thank you, everyone.
So, Karen, your wonderful book reminds us that memory is rarely a straight line. So, for many survivors and their children, the past wasn't something that was spoken about. It was something survived through silence. You grew up in Australia believing one version of your life, only to discover that your family's reality was way more complex, harrowing, and miraculous than you probably ever imagined. So, if as a teen and child you knew little about your mother's past, I'm wondering what the specific spark or moment was that made you realize that the family stories you were told didn't exactly align with the truth.
Well, I think it went way back. I realized something my grandmother told me. Her name was Alicia when I was 4 years old. I was in her kitchen and I asked her what the blue-green numbers were on her arm. And she put her knife down and she said, "Oh, that's my phone number." I had it tattooed especially, so I'd never forget it. Um, I knew my mother and my grandparents were born in Poland, and that my grandparents were atheist, but they didn't, as you said, they didn't talk about the war. And then when my mother was 32, she got a letter from a stranger who told her that she had been born inside the Warsaw ghetto and was smuggled out in a backpack and later rescued by a notorious Nazi SS officer, and that the parents who brought her to Australia as refugees actually weren't her parents. And so I was a teenager when I found that out, but I still knew very little about the war. Forward a few years later, I mean, the book really came about, the spark that led to the book. My grandmother asked me to take her to Schindler's List when the movie came out. And so this is a woman who's never talked about the war to anyone. And she asked me to take her, not my mother or her brother. And a week or so later in a restaurant, she asked me to take her out to dinner. And I was drinking a glass of red wine and eating a risotto. And she starts telling me about Dr. Mengele, who the Auschwitz prisoners called the Angel of Death, and how he would line her up and the other women in line for hours and inspect her with his white gloves and whip. And I wondered why she was telling me. And years later, I learned that Holocaust survivors often tell their grandchildren what they can't tell their own children. But the spark for the book came after I moved to the US, and for the first time I was surrounded by Jewish people I worked with, my neighbors. They celebrated holidays I never heard of, like Rosh Hashanah. And so they asked me questions about my family, and I didn't have the answers. And so I asked my grandmother if I could interview her. And I flew home from Australia for vacation, and over a week, she told me a version of her story that she was able to tell me. And on the last day, she said to me, I worry what happened to me, it's going to happen again. Do you think someone will want to know all this? And that's when I promised her I would write the story. This is a long answer to your question, but
Oh, it's amazing.
she passed away. My career took off in the US and I didn't fulfill that promise. And I must have been thinking about her because one night I Googled her last name, which was Dortheimer. And I came across an article in the Wall Street Journal, and it wasn't gated. And it was describing an exhibit at the Museum of Jewish Heritage called Filming the Camps. And I clicked on a link that led to a film clip, and I found myself looking at this interview of my grandfather. So the Filming Camps exhibit was about Hollywood filmmakers John Ford and George Stevens, who went in with the US Army as they liberated the camps. And a couple of days after they liberated Dachau, they interviewed my grandfather, Mietek, who had never talked about the war. And he was, he would play hide and seek with me and play chasey. And here I was looking at this interview,
One of the
which
things that I found kind of so stunning as I was thinking about this evening was that the the trigger in some ways for writing the book has everything to do with the museum that is hosting the
exactly,
discussion.
exactly. And I feel so thankful for that because if it wasn't for the museum, I wouldn't have quit my job and I wouldn't have quit my job and gone to Poland and actually have written this book. So I think Isabel's going to show you that clip now.
Now, though, he's had his view of Dachau.
Roll number 4, XPX Germany, Dachau concentration camp, Mr. Dortheimer.
Rolling. Thank you. Mr. Dortheimer, how long have you been held as a prisoner?
I've been held as a prisoner since 3 years.
3 years.
3 years.
Why are you held as a prisoner?
Because I'm a Jew. That was a matter that I was taken in prison. They treated us as worse than the worst beast. Every night, every day, he was afraid not to be taken to the crematorium, not to be killed by gun, for everything you could be could have the death.
Have you had many friends that have gone to the crematory?
No one of my friends left. All are in the crematoriums or in the crematorium. That was the best way.
Many of your friends have gone to the
Oh
crematorium.
yes, all.
Oh, God.
All have gone. Future, that's a question about which we have not in picture now. We are more than sure that nobody left from our families. Only this small, this few men which are here. So we are now without homes. Our homes we are expelled out from our homes in Poland as the ghettos have been made, and then we have been put out from the ghettos and taken to the concentration camps. Now the problem, every other nations can go home. They know the addresses, they know that there is somebody waiting on there, the family, the wives, the fathers, the children, and we don't know what will be now with us. We have no place to go back. We are as beggars without home, without anything.
He was 34 years old and he weighed 85 pounds. And I didn't know at the time I saw this that even though he was an atheist, the Jews in Dachau elected him as their leader to represent them. And that shortly after this, the US Army hired him. He was a lawyer in Poland before the war, but was unable to work as a lawyer because of the anti-Jewish laws in Poland. And they hired him to work on the Dachau and Nuremberg trials as part of the war crimes branch. But you can imagine the shock of seeing this clip, which I eventually went to see at the museum after I came back from Poland. But it just sent me to Poland to find out about who my family were before the war. But also my mother asked me to find some of the people who saved her during the war.
I'm wondering if before you share with us about the research and what you learned about the incredible characters that that emerge over the course of this really masterful memoir, what is it like for you to be uncovering these sources with family members that you know in one way and that you're then learning about in an entirely different way? I mean, you must have seen this clip now dozens and dozens of times, and yet I can see that it still affects you. And so how has that work been for you?
Well, it's changed me. And for anybody else that's doing this kind of research, I can tell you it's going to change you. I don't think I realized how much it had changed me until it took me 10 years to write this book. I was not a writer when I started out. I had to learn how to write. Unlike you, Robin, I was not a historian. I had to learn how journalistic techniques to go and do all this research. And then I had to turn it into a story that people would want to read. And I think the hardest thing, after year 9, when I started showing this book to literary agents, they told me that I was missing from the book. And that if this was going to get published traditionally, I needed to be in the book. And I didn't think this was my story to tell. And I think that was the hardest thing, was putting myself in the book. And I did that by making it relatable because Isabel mentioned it won an award for Best Family Drama. Well, the book really is a family drama because at the heart of it, the way I was able to put myself in the book, agents told me I needed to be the conduit to this history. What was it like growing up with these damaged people? And at the heart of the book is this toxic relationship between my mother, Joasia, and my grandmother, Alicia. And I will call her my grandmother because she was the grandmother I adored and loved, and she adored me, but she seemed to not be able to stand being in the same room as my mother. And after I'd interviewed Alicia, I knew that she had risked her life multiple times to save her sister's child. So the woman, my biological grandmother was Irena, was her sister. And so she risked her life over and over to save my mother. And yet she seemed to hate her. So at the heart of the book is me examining or going through with a contemporary eye, studying this relationship in the present timeline against this backdrop of the history. So it did affect me because I had to make myself vulnerable and honest about what it was like to grow up with these people.
I mean, your book really makes clear that the trauma of the Holocaust didn't end in 1945, but trickled through the generations. I don't know how much of the family story you're willing to share with us, but can you maybe offer one or two threads that demonstrate how this, where this trauma comes from? I don't want to give away too much. I want to let you be the one to share what it is that you wish to share from the family story.
I think it's the relationships, you know. Since I've published the book, I've met many children and grandchildren of survivors, and I didn't grow up around them besides my own cousins. And you know, some of you on the Zoom might be able to relate to this. We think our childhoods are pretty normal until we're older, and I realized my childhood was pretty dysfunctional, and a lot of it was this toxic relationship between my mother and my grandmother. So I didn't really see the trauma as a child, except for my grandmother snapping at my mother all the time and talking down to her. I did have often when I would visit my grandfather Mirtek, the man you saw in the video, who before the war was a bit of a jokester. He was an optimistic man, but my memory of him as a child, he would swing from playing with me and tickling me to sometimes I would stay over, which was around one every week or every 2 weeks. And he would be just sitting in his velvet chair, a blue velvet chair, staring at a wall for days. And I didn't, people tried to hide the fact from us that he was suffering with depression. And of course, now having studied the Holocaust, I know that, and talking to other children of survivors, that many of their parents who survived Auschwitz and Dachau and camps like that dealt with it in different ways. In my grandmother's case, she seemed to survive by through her bitterness and anger. She was also very angry at the man who sent the letter to my mother. And she was a bitter, angry person, although she wasn't towards me. I saw that towards other people. And in my grandfather's case, he had this horrible, horrible depression that I've learned more about since. I mean, many children of survivors that I've met, they're particularly Auschwitz survivors. I'm thinking of two in particular whose their mothers committed suicide when they were 14 and 21. So people deal with it in different ways. If anybody's read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, we know that people got through the camps by having a little goal. Those that survived. In Alicia's case, my grandmother's, hers was anger towards this man who sent the letter. That's my theory. And in other people's case, it might be thinking about hugging a loved one. In the man that you saw in the video, in Metek's case, he dealt with he wanted to prosecute the Nazis. And so he would make the men in the bunks at night recite the names of the worst perpetrators along with the SS names. And so that one day he knew that he would be involved. He wanted to be involved in trialing these criminals. So that's how he survived. But then after the war, to enter into a civil society, they had to wall it all up. I don't know what it was like in the US, but in Australia there were no counselors. And my grandmother told me that she nobody asked any questions. They could see the number on her arm, and when they got together with survivors, they would talk about it, but they couldn't believe what had happened to them themselves. How could they tell anyone else? And so when you bottle that in, the trauma comes out in different ways. And in our family, it came out through, for me, my lens was the relationships, this toxic relationship with my mother, between my mother and Alicia.
I mean, there's so much hiding in the book, right? Your mother was a hidden child. There are the ways in which individuals throughout the book are kind of hiding their true selves. And the even with this the letter, which maybe you're willing to talk a little bit about with again, it's everyone should read the memoir, no matter what pieces of information get revealed. But um, there's a way in which even when there's like the pushing towards the so-called truth, we still have hiding. So can you tell us a little bit about the letter and what you learned about your family history?
Sure. So the word truth, I'm just going to dive into that for a minute
I mean, I
because
did you like my little bunny ears?
yeah, exactly. What is truth for, and we need to think about that today too. You know, we live in a world where we want really binary answers, yes or no, good or evil. Well, life's not like that. And I really learned writing this book that the truth has a variable too. And my grandmother's version of the truth, Alicia's version of the truth was the breadcrumbs that she gave me, the bits of her past that she was able to share with me. So this letter was sent from Canada, um, and the man who sent it, his Polish name is Stisław. I knew him as Dick, which is much easier to pronounce than Stisław. Um, and he was my mother's biological father. And he was an interesting man. For those of you that have a connection to Poland, he he was an officer in the army, and he, after his wife Irena, my biological mother, was murdered, hiding in a house outside of Warsaw with my mother, he joined the AK, the underground, and so that's maybe less common for Jewish people, but he joined the underground, and my grandmother didn't know this, but she ended up getting arrested. So she was zigzagging around occupied Poland on false papers trying to outfox the Nazis. And after Irina was killed in this house, and this was all in the letter. This was this letter that my mother read described getting out of the ghetto, described the man, Roman Talakovsky, who helped my mother get out of the ghetto. And he found the family this place to hide in an attic room outside of Warsaw. And that's where the Gestapo found and killed Irena. And my mother was, my grandmother, Alicia, the one grandmother I grew up with, she was the one who offered to take my mother while she was outboxing the Nazis. And so when they were all arrested, it was because Dick, which I discovered through my research and through interviewing, talking to him, he was arrested because there was this big underground roundup. The Gestapo sort of did a blitz on rounding up members of the underground. So he was a really interesting sort of not as the stereotype of the typical Polish Jew. And I
And
actually went to live with him. So when I discovered the truth by asking an accidental question, during my gap year, I actually went to live with him in Poland. And he had a very different view of Poland and living in Poland before the war than Alicia did. And their versions of events rarely lined up. So I got to know him. I knew him better than my mother did because I lived with him in Canada for a while.
How did your mother survive then as this young child? Where was she hiding? And how
How
did
does
you
anybody
and
survive? I mean,
and
it
how
was a
did
bit
you
of
find
luck.
out?
So she survived because of people's bravery, including Alicia's. I mean, the the fact that she actually took my mother, who looked like me. So my grandmother Alicia had auburn colored hair, and she spoke perfect Polish, so she was able to blend in with the local population once she was on false papers. But my mother, sorry, looks like me. She had jet black hair, chocolate eyes. She was a very dangerous child to be walking around in a stroller. So she survived because Alicia risked her life to take her. And she also survived because of Dick's ingenuity. He found af after they took my mother, they were uh, all in this uh, factory in central Poland near Radom. Well, sorry, Dick was working in a job in Radom, and at night he would be hiding members of the resistance and Jews under floorboards in a factory warehouse. And Mietek, the man you saw in the video, he was managing this sawmill about 25 miles from where Dick was. And so Mietek and Alicia had my mother and they were looking after her. And then when they all got arrested, my mother was left behind at the sawmill. So they were arrested by the Polish police and taken to this notorious prison. And that is where my grandmother Alicia encountered this Nazi SS officer who also ended up saving my mother's life. I
It
mean,
is so staggering. I mean,
yeah,
there are so many twists and turns. And people should both read the memoir and your incredible essay on the SS officers saving your mother's life. When you learned about that twist in your mother's story, how did it make you feel? It pushes up against so many of the assumptions that we have about perpetrators and victims and bystanders.
yeah. Um, well, like I said, human behavior is complicated, right? And um, I think one of my favorite things to do is when I tell the story in schools with school children, they
Mhm.
often ask me, was he evil or was he good? And I love throwing that back at them because he was a murderer. I know from my grandmother and from my talking to historians that he was in charge of interrogating the women in my grandmother's cell, and he killed some of them. He sent them back to her cell with broken bones, and she claimed that he didn't touch her. I'm putting that in air quotes. And so I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today if he hadn't have done something that saved my mother's life. But at the same time, he was a murderer. War is complicated. Uh, History is complicated. People's motives are complicated. I don't know. I mean, I have my theories about why he saved my mother, but I don't know for sure. But he ended up placing her in a convent, and that's where my mother spent the rest of the war. So that was around mid 1944. She was placed in that convent.
And that's where Irena comes in, correct?
No, Irena was my biological mother. It's a really
Oh, right.
complicated story. So
So
she
what was
was
the name of the
murdered.
nun?
Oh, that's Sister Cornelia. The
Cornelia.
the Sister Cornelia who was assigned to look after my mother.
Mhm.
So again, she looked like me, so she had to be hidden. So these sisters had there was a school on their property, and they turned it into an orphanage for Polish children during the war, aged between, sorry, I'm just going to have a quick drink.
Yes.
Children aged between um, mostly between 11 and 17 years old. And because my mother looked like me and she was around 3 years old at the time, she had to sleep in Sister Cornelia's room. There was also an SS outpost on this building, so they had to protect her from the eyes of the SS. So she developed this special relationship with Sister Cornelia. And
How
I
did,
learned
oh, go
that
ahead.
um, the nuns prayed a number of times a day. So, I had this vision of this convent being a big brick building, but it didn't turn out to be like that. It was a smaller wooden building, and the convent chapel was underneath Cornelia's room. So she would take my mother there multiple times a day, and she had to learn to sit still while she prayed, while Cornelia prayed.
So much of the memoir is about your kind of mother's hidden Jewish identity. And even just thinking about your mother in the convent, sitting quietly while the nuns are worshiping multiple times a day. I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit about how this research has shaped your own thinking about your Jewish identity, about your mother's Jewish identity, about your grandparents' Jewish identity. And it sounds very much, when you introduced your grandfather, you said something like, despite the fact that he was an atheist, right? Da 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 da. So I'm curious how you've kind of, in throwing yourself into the story, how you've come to sit with the Jewish identities.
Well, there's another twist in the story, and I hope everybody is sitting down because I understood it when I took my mother back to this convent. My mother raised me Christian, and not just Christian, evangelical Christian. And, I had never been to a synagogue until I moved to the US, and she hadn't been either. All my grandparents, Alicia and Mietek's friends that I met, the people I met in their living room drinking coffee, many actually who had the Auschwitz tattoo, they weren't, they were atheist or agnostic too. So I grew up in a Christian church, and it wasn't until I moved to the US that I got curious about the Jewish sort of identity. And I actually took a class that was advertised in the Boston Globe, which is where I lived. Uh, it turned out to be from a Reform synagogue, a rabbi, and it was Judaism 101. And so I took that class, and I write about this in the book. This is the identity I really wanted to embrace because the rabbi told me that a central tenet of being Jewish is embracing doubt. And for me, that was a game changer because in the evangelical church, you just believe what the pastor says from the platform. The Bible is literal, and I couldn't cope with any of that. I also didn't understand the complexity of my grandmother and my family history. How could there be a God when he allowed the Holocaust to happen? So this whole notion of doubt um, really made me feel very very Jewish. And I think you can see this in the book. I become really a sort of detective interrogator. I think the National Jewish Book Award said it reads like a thriller. Well, I hope that's the way people will find themselves reading the book because there are many twists and turns. And part of that is this whole thing of Jewish identity. And you'll see my mother's arc. She ends up doing her bat mitzvah after I actually took her to Poland to meet these sisters, and when we came back, she did her bat mitzvah with two other child Holocaust survivors. And so for me, being, I mean, my feeling about my Jewish identity has changed. For all of us, it changed after October 7th. I feel more Jewish now than I ever have before. I feel more Jewish when I'm in Poland than anywhere else. And that's complicated too. But over the 10 years it took me to write the book, I've definitely embraced my being Jewish. It's just that Jewish identity is complicated. And I think, especially after October 7th, we got so many people who are telling us what being Jewish is, what being a Zionist is. We need to own our own identity. And if, in the case of our family, my family, as you'll read in Irena's gift, Jewish identity is just as complicated as history and human behavior.
I mean, it's such a fascinating kind of arc, right? And part of what I hold on to as I read your book is this compassion for a a woman who is trying to figure out her own life and the life of multiple family members who she clearly loves. Like there's a lot of love in this book.
Hmm.
And I appreciate that there's a lot of angst and snark and other things as well, and bitterness. I mean, certainly with your grandmother, but you love your characters, and you even seem to love the doubt. You love the sort of the curiosity and the unknowing. And I'm curious whether there's still some of the story that you don't yet know. Like, are there still questions that you want answered as you're learning about your family, and your family's history?
Well, for those of us who've done this kind of research, yes, there will always be questions. When are we done? Like life, every day we learn. I think through our own experiences, when we experience something, we have questions about something we saw about when we were growing up. I wish, in one way, I'm glad my grandmother is not alive today, particularly given what just happened in Australia and what has been happening in Australia. Um, but in other ways, I wish I could. I know she would be really happy that her story is told, that she wanted the world to know what happened to her. I have so many questions I want to ask her, particularly about what happened in that prison and the sacrifices she made to save my mother's life.
What do you think? I mean, she shared her story with you. Um,
The version she could, yes.
right, the version she could. And I'm wondering, as a child, as a grandchild of a woman who also only shared her story with me and wasn't willing to share it with others, I'm wondering what you think the human cost was for her.
Mm.
Was there a human cost for her to share the story? Um, did she know? Do you think she knew that she was sort of pulling out the thread that was then going to kind of lead
Unravel.
things unraveling?
Um, well, I think the in a way Schindler's List liberated her. Um, and then because it was the first time that really publicly that there was any, certainly in Australia, that it was in the public sphere really talking openly about the Holocaust. But I think talking to me did heal her in a little bit, so much so that the Shoah Foundation actually asked her to do a recording with them. So she was interviewed a couple of years after she talked to me. Again, she told them the version that was safest to tell.
And it was
So
urgent to tell.
yes, and there were gaps, and like I mentioned, there were inconsistencies in what Dick, who was a real facts and figures man, and I helped him to write his memoir, or he
Mm.
wrote, it was written in Polish and it was translated into English, and I helped him with the translation. And so I had like a timeline of events with specifics that I could check with historians or check against documentation. But in my grandmother's case, um, there were these inconsistencies, and I realized that there's a scene in the book. I don't know how we're going for time, but there's a scene in the book I describe her. I was at her place, and I'd lost a button on my cardigan, and I asked her for a needle and thread to sew it back on. And she snapped at me, and she snapped at my mother, but she never snapped at me. And she said, I've never sewn anything in my life. Why would I have a needle and thread in the house? And at that dinner, in that restaurant, after Schindler's List, I had naively asked her, because I knew very little about the Holocaust, what was the worst thing that happened to you? And at that dinner, she told me it was when an SS officer in Auschwitz found a nightdress that she had sewn together using scraps of fabric that she said she traded for a piece of bread with women coming back from the factories. And remember, so she told me that she couldn't sew, but then she told me she'd sewn this nightdress together. And you would talk about trauma. That was the worst thing that happened to her, because losing that nightdress, she would put it on at night and she would remember that she wasn't a number. She was a human being who used to have a clean nightdress to put on. And so losing that, she kind of lost hope. So it wasn't that she didn't lie, that she lied to me, that she told me, that she'd never sewn anything together in her life. I just think it was a trauma response, and it was a way of keeping inside of her all the horrible things that happened to her at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück and other places.
Memory is an incredible thing. I know that we're kind of coming to a time where we're going to move soon for the Q&A, so people do remember to ask your questions in the Q&A. The project in many ways started here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a place that's dedicated to living memorials. I'm wondering what you hope the next generation takes away from your family's story of survival. And I know that you have a clip that might fit well with that question.
I think the power of this story is the power of kindness and empathy. I wouldn't be here if a few people hadn't have shown my mother kindness instead of indifference or hate. And the clip we're going to show you is my mother going back to Poland, meeting these sisters. And I hope when you see the kindness of these sisters, you will understand why she survived.
Just listen.
No może śpiewa,
Okay. Na Joasia. Joasia.
Witam serdecznie. To jest siostra, którą Kornelii Jankowskiej, która się Joasią opiekowała. Tak. Tak, tak. No, ale to zniszczone strasznie jest teraz. A tam był internet.
I remember them as mountains. I remember that.
You do remember that?
I remember being out here. I think I played out here.
Which is amazing, because if the SS was in this building, they were watching you.
It's amazing that they didn't
Kill
shoot me.
I know.
To strasznie zmarnowane wszystko.
What's that mean?
Wow.
It still brings tears to my eyes when I see that because that trip just gave my mother so much closure on her life. It really helps. So for those of you that are pursuing the history of your own family members, I really encourage you to keep going.
So perhaps that dovetails nicely with one of the questions, which was, do you have advice for people who are looking to research their own family's history with World War II or the Holocaust?
Um, Yes, reach out. I think, Robin and I met because someone introduced us. I didn't know about research techniques. Learn a little bit about how to do some sort of journalistic research. There were so many resources out there. The country where there are Facebook groups that will put you in touch with genealogical institutes. The Holocaust Museum the U.S. Holocaust Museum is a great place to start. They have there's tracing services and historical resources available at the Holocaust Museum. When I arrived, they had like a file this big. They were extremely helpful. And then don't be afraid to reach out to historians. I have met so many people who are just as, they're putting together puzzles in their own area of research. And when they meet somebody for example, that prison, there were out of the 500 underground members in that prison who were tortured, there was only one Jewish one, and that was my grandfather. So a particular historian that I reached out to was really interested in that. So historians will help you. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask. Use your network, social media, chat GPT, whatever works. Just be curious and read a lot.
I love the historians are not scary people.
Yeah, exactly.
I should get a t-shirt. Uh, One of the questions from an audience member concerns the general reaction to the book. How has various audiences reacted, and also how did your family react?
Well, the book was published by Penguin Random House in Australia first and the UK. And I wrote the book so it would appeal to people who knew nothing about the Holocaust, which is why the family drama aspect was really important. So it did, up until October 7th, it did really well. My dream was that it would be in the equivalent of Walmart and Kmart. I wanted it to reach a mass market audience. And I got messages from around the world from people who wouldn't have picked it up if they knew it was a true story, but now they know the history. So the reaction has been positive. In the US, I've been talking more to Jewish audiences, which has been really interesting for me. And listening to other people's stories, I've met a lot of children and grandchildren of survivors, helping them, just like that question we got, if I can help someone do the same thing in their family and solve the puzzle, it's a privilege. Not many of us get to publish a book. It's really difficult, particularly after October 7th, for Jewish authors to get books published. So the reaction has been overall very positive. Yes, I get my hate mail, but that means I'm doing a good job too because I'm pushing somebody's buttons.
And how did your family react to the book?
So I don't think one of my brothers has read the book. My sister just finished reading it. I think the history was too close to them. Um, One of the characters in the book, my uncle, my mum's brother, he didn't react positively in the beginning, and I encouraged him to finish it because my grandmother Alicia is a hero in the book. She's not presented, she's presented warts and all in the beginning, and he didn't like that. But now we're very close, and he tells me things about growing up with his parents that he's never told his wife. So, it's very rewarding and it means a lot.
Can you talk a little bit? One of the audience members asked about the research process. So what did that process look like for you? And also, was there anything that really surprised you? I guess maybe the question should be, is there anything that didn't surprise you? But maybe talk about the research process, and if you could choose one thing that surprised you the most, perhaps that.
I think doing research now is probably different than when I started 10 years ago because we do have more technologies changed a lot. And if you start with ChatGPT, just make sure check the links and anything that it tells you. Start with, if you can, with primary interviews. The survivors are sadly passing away. If you have survivors in your family or people who've lived with survivors, interview them and learn how to interview them. Open-ended questions, no yes or no, questions that don't lead to yes and no answers. Silence is good. When somebody starts sharing their memories, let them talk. Don't butt in, and they just often just keep going. So primary research, secondary research. I mean, there's family research and then there's writing a book. So for me, I would spend all day trying to write sometimes two sentences. I wanted the book to be very cinematic. I wanted people to feel, smell, and be able to touch what was happening. So I would watch a lot of Nazi propaganda videos, particularly of the Warsaw ghetto, and then I would listen and watch. Again, the Shoah Foundation has a great resource there of interviews with people who were in the same place as my family members. So secondary research, history, books, history professors, and then learning how to write, just read a lot if anybody's trying to write their own books. Read a lot of good storytelling.
Another question asked about the Nazi officer, and can you say a little bit more about him and what happened to him after the war?
So he was of Ukrainian background, which really helped me. When you said were there any surprises in the research, my grandmother couldn't remember his name. She could remember a lot of things about him, but she couldn't remember his name. And so I spent a lot of time. This is the kind of romanticizing the research process. A lot of my friends said, you're that's what the book's going to be about. You're going to find the Nazi and you're going to find something that my grandmother had to give away in order to convince this Nazi to save my mother. And that's not what the book's about. The more I learned about him, the more I didn't want him to be the hero of the story and the apparatus that he belonged to. Yes, he did one thing that saved my grandmother's life and also my mother's life. That doesn't make him the hero, the total hero of the story. I found out I chose not to disclose his name and what happened to him after the war because I realized during my research I encountered a group of children of perpetrators of war criminals who were helping people like me. And one was the daughter. uh, After I realized that she had this horrible childhood with her father, who turned out to be a commandant of a concentration camp, I realized that children don't get to choose their parents. And so I didn't want to reveal too much about him to protect his children from whatever happened to them growing up with somebody who did these things.
Wow. Um, how have you created some of these networks with children of perpetrators? Maybe can you say a little bit more? You said that.
Oh, I didn't create it. There's a lot of serendipity in this book. I was sitting on a plane next to a woman who was doing a PhD and she was interviewing children of war criminals, children, grandchildren. And she, while I was in Berlin looking for this Nazi, she put me in touch with an organization in the Boston, it happened to be in the Boston area. I think it's called One to One, and it's still in existence today, I think. And they have these conferences and activities connecting children of perpetrators with children of victims.
How did you insert yourself into the structure of the book? So you mentioned earlier that the publishers had encouraged you to insert yourself. One of the audience members asked, how did you insert yourself into the structure of the book? What techniques did you employ to do so?
Yeah, that's a good writing craft question. So I took a lot of classes to learn how to write, and one of the best advice is splitting yourself into two. So there's what we call the I character. So that's the flawed person who the action is happening to. So I'm in this, the opening scene is showing this weird relationship between my mother and me. And so I'm in that scene as a character. And then up here, there's the I narrator, the me, who in my case is like a detective, the storyteller, the trusted narrator who's guiding the reader through the story. Hey, look at this. You need to pay attention to this. I'm going to give you this bit of history, or this is what Alicia said, but this is the historical aspect. So it's the credible narrator. So I didn't want to insert myself. It was a really difficult process for me, and I think was the most difficult part of writing the book. I realized I had my own walls, that I had been hiding a lot of what it was like to grow up with these people. I don't think I saw my mother's pain as much as I did when I started inserting myself in the book, and that made it very difficult to write about. But then I also realized somebody in my writing group pointed out, this whole thing is about you trying to heal your mother's pain, even though you don't realize it. And I realized that's what I was trying to do in my detective interrogator way.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you gave a gift to Irena, right? You gave a certain kind of gift to your mother, and that is the gift of this book of finding.
Yes, and before she passed away, I was able to read the manuscript to her, and it gave her such closure on her life. But I found myself hiding bits from her. There were things about Dick that I didn't tell her. Um, there were things about Alicia, the actions Alicia took that I didn't tell her. So the weird thing about this history is, for years, my Alicia and Mietek lied to my mother, and then she lied to protect me. They lied to protect her. She lied to protect me, didn't tell me about the letter. And then I found myself keeping the truth from my mother. So, the theme really is we all lie to protect people we love.
Things we do for love.
Yeah.
And perhaps, given that it's 8 o'clock, we end on a note of love. And I'll also add on a note of admiration. Karen, this is an incredible book. And you give us all a gift by having written it. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Isabel, too. And thank you to the museum, because without you, this book never would have happened.
Well, thank you both. Just before we leave, another huge thank you to both of you for coming and speaking to our audience tonight. And of course, thank you to our audience, as always, for joining us. To our audience, if you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum, which you can do at mjhnyc.org/support. We also hope that you'll join us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events. Wishing you a great evening, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.